Hello, this is the Stick Figure Historian, where we make history with stickmen. It's going to be totally awesome, guys. So, in episode 8, I talked about how Roger Williams first began his colony of Providence Plantations. Now, we'll hear about how it was governed. From the start, Roger clearly stated that matters of government and matters of religion must remain forever and entirely separate. This is an idea commonly referred to nowadays as separation of church and state. And actually, that term comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut back in 1802. Jefferson referred to a wall of separation between church and state within this letter, when he was telling the Baptists that he promised he would protect their rights to practice their religion. There's some that speculate Jefferson actually got some of his ideas of how the United States government should operate from the Baptists, but I better stay on target here. Right, church and state. So, basically, in Providence, the government could not pass any laws for or against a particular religion, and they couldn't punish or exclude people based on their religion either. Though a familiar concept to us today, this was a thing unheard of back in those days. In fact, Roger Williams' colony was the very first government among the ages to operate under these principles. The leader of Providence Plantations was the governor. Roger Williams was, of course, the first of these. But the governor didn't have complete control. He was supposed to listen to the people and make decisions based on what they wanted. Every oldest man in a family group who owned land, called a head of household, would meet together often and vote on any matters that came up in governing the colony. And sadly, I must note here that not absolutely everyone was allowed to vote. You'll notice I said that part of what made a man allowed to vote was if he owned land. If he didn't own land, then he couldn't vote. This is totally unfair, but it was nonetheless a common notion in those days. And in later days too, actually. John Locke, the famous political philosopher, was a huge supporter of letting only the rich have voting rights. He lived from 1632 to 1704 and heavily influenced the worldview of the Founding Fathers, including their thoughts about poor people and who should be allowed to vote. Kinda duplistic if you ask me. But I'm on a rabbit trail again. The very same year Providence was formed, 1636, trouble and bloodshed came to the shores of New England. It started with the death of a trader named John Oldham. Not funny. It started with the death of a trader named John Oldham, whose boat was attacked by Indians on Block Island, just off the southern coast of what today is Rhode Island. Although that is where the bloodshed began, I should say, for the trouble began much earlier. I'll explain. You see, a few years earlier, several Indian chiefs had come to the people of Plymouth in Massachusetts and asked them to send men to come and live in the land that is now called Connecticut. And here's Connecticut on a map, so you can see where it is in relation to Massachusetts and Providence. These Indian chiefs wished the white men to live in Connecticut so that they could help them fight against their great enemies, the Pequot tribe. The leading men of Massachusetts were quite pleased at this idea, because they saw that it would allow them to get control of the Connecticut River before the Dutch got all of it. And it was only natural the men of Massachusetts should help fight against the Pequots, since that tribe was allied with their Dutch rivals. Well, the Dutchmen were not at all happy about the English settling on the Connecticut River. Their colony was called New Netherland, I know, super original. And you can get a bit of an idea from this map, the area that they were laying claim to here. The governor of New Netherland sent a little army to drive the English out. But when they saw how strongly that the English had planted themselves and how bravely they stood to fight against them, they quickly decided it wasn't worth fighting over and left. Now, John Oldham, this trader who I had just spoke of, was one of the Englishmen who had come to settle in Connecticut. Kinda a crazy guy, actually. I don't think many people were too sad to see him go. I mean, if you're the guy who's got a reputation for pulling out a knife on the governor of Plymouth when you got into an argument with him, I mean, that just doesn't sit very well with the Puritan type. Oldham started the town of Wethersfield and was making good money trading between his countrymen and the friendly Indians. He was in a boat one day with his 2 young nephews and a small crew of men, sailing in the coastal waters just west of Connecticut. They were on another trading expedition, a good one so far, and were just stopping at Block Island to do business with some Indians there, but that's where the success was ended. A band of Indians allied with the Narragansett attacked Oldham's little boat, killing him and almost everyone on board. Only the nephews were saved alive, and they were taken prisoner by the braves. Somehow, the 2 youngsters managed later to escape and bring the story back to Massachusetts. Outraged, the general court began breathing out vengeance against their murdered sons. Not sure how they decided they liked Oldham so well after all, but oh well. John Endicott was sent to Block Island to carry fire and sword through the Indian villages there in retaliation. It was a very cruel and unjust thing to do, for those poor people had nothing to do with all the trouble. The murderers had escaped to take refuge with the Pequots. But the governor of Massachusetts didn't care. After this terrible deed, he sent to the Pequots, demanding that they hand over the murderers. But the Pequots refused, and thus the blood feud was begun. The Pequots would strike at white settlements, then the settlers would get them back. A terrible, endless game of give and take. It looked like there was going to be outright war. But outright war was something the general court wished to avoid, if possible. It wasn't as if it was just the Pequots who would be coming up against them, for they were allied with the Narragansett as well. And despite the fact the white men had better weapons, they didn't actually have a very large fighting force compared to what the Indians could muster. There was a good chance that the Indians could annihilate them, if they really wanted to, or weaken them so that the Dutch could snatch their lands. Massachusetts needed to get some of the Indians on their side quickly before things got out of hand. This was a job that was going to require a lot of care, and someone who the Indians knew they could trust. Someone like Roger Williams. Yeah, it sounds unbelievable, but the General Court actually asked Roger to act as their agent among the Indian tribes. They were begging a favor from the man they had just banished, not a full year before. And even more unbelievable, Roger agreed to help them. Seriously. Seriously, dude. Like, these are the guys that just tried to ship you off to prison. And now you're helping them? What is wrong with you? It's just one of those things in history that I can't explain to you. Perhaps someone knew or knows why, but I don't. Perhaps Roger did this service not as a favor to the governors of Massachusetts Bay Colony, but as a way to protect his own people from being slaughtered. In any case, Roger was now putting all his experience and knowledge of the Indian language and culture to the use of politics, on which the life or death of many men depended.